America. That's coming up next on Book TV.
Thanks for that kind introduction. It's truly an honor to be here at the Museum of Chinese in America, an institution that has done so much to increase public understanding of not only the Chinese immigrant experience in the United States, but also of Asian Americans and the Asian diaspora more generally. I'm particularly, I'm an editor at the New York Times, and I mostly traffic in words and do careful editing. I'm very attentive, I try to be, to nuances of word selection, diction, syntax, but also meaning. But I'm also very, very aware of the acute and enduring power, thank you very much, of images. And what was most striking to me in looking at these two books is the immense visual array of what's been amassed here, which is really something quite distinctive. I don't think in any of the books that I've read about Arab Americans, about Asian Americans, have I seen such a visually rich and frankly disturbing collection of images. So I think that's very impressive. I'm going to very briefly introduce, because their biographies are in the program, our three speakers this evening, and then they'll each proceed to to give a brief presentation about why they decided to write their book, or in the case, or collect their documents, these artifacts. And then we'll have some moderated Q&A from me, and then, most excitingly, some questions, I hope, from you, the audience. So thank you. To my immediate right is John Tchen, who often goes by Jack, if I'm not mistaken. He's a historian, curator, and writer, very significantly a founder of this museum, which was previously the Chinatown Historical Society, if I'm not mistaken.
New York Chinatown History Project. But
my apologies.
It's hard to remember.
Yes. And I remember when it was down on
East Broadway, and then
yeah.
And then in the school building.
Yeah, a very rich history of now almost 35 years. He is also the founding director of the Asian Pacific American Studies Program and Institute at NYU, and a founding faculty member of the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis. Jack has just completed a critical archival study of images, excerpts, and essays, Yellow Peril, the subject of the discussion this evening. He's also the senior historian for an upcoming exhibition on the Chinese exclusion period for the New York Historical Society. And his next book, Chinaman, Exclusion, the American Promise, will be published alongside the exhibition. To Jack's right is Dylan Yeats, a doctoral candidate in history at NYU. He specializes in United States history with a focus on the political demonology and structures of authority. He writes and teaches about American politics, Asian American history, and Islamophobia. He's also a public historian, a trained archivist, and a sightseeing guide who is licensed to give tours in New York City. I'd like to take one sometime.
All right.
Finally, at the end of the table is Dr. Jack Shaheen. His lectures and writings have focused on negative images and stereotypes of Asians, blacks, and other minorities or disadvantaged groups in the world. He is a former CBS News consultant on Middle Eastern affairs, has been a professional film consultant on very, very popular hits like Syriana and Three Kings, which I'd like to learn more about. And he's received several awards for his contributions to cultural understanding. And his new book, A is for Arab, Archiving Stereotypes in U.S. Popular Culture, draws from a trove of objects and materials from a collection that he has donated and deposited at New York University. This is a very, very special collection of more than 4,000 images, including motion pictures, cartoons, and television programs, as well as toys and games featuring anti-Arab and anti-Muslim depictions. So we're going to actually start with Jack Shaheen, and then we will move to Jack Tchen and Dylan Yeats. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that very gracious introduction. I'm extremely pleased to return to this museum. I was here right after it opened a few years ago and was impressed with the commonalities that exist within Asian Americans and Arab Americans, and some of the stereotypes that they've had to endure over all these years. And I want to compliment my dear friends and colleagues, Dylan Yeats and Jack Tchen, on their new book, Yellow Peril, which is a brilliant book. I couldn't put it down. Professor Tchen offered to buy me a latte if I plug the book tonight, so I'll take him up on it as soon as the session has ended. But seriously, the A is for Arab book is based on 4 decades of work, whereby I, along with my dear wife Bernice, went about collecting images of Arabs in American popular culture. More than 2,000 films and television shows, hundreds of comic books, toys and games, cartoons, and it all began innocently, actually. I never intended to look at this particular topic. I don't look Arab, you know, I have green eyes, and Shaheen sounds Irish. So it was sort of nothing that really appealed to me until one day. I was upstairs, it was in the mid-70s, and my children came running up the steps saying, "Daddy, Daddy, they've got bad Arabs on." And I really didn't know quite what to do, except I went downstairs, and there on the television set we saw cartoons like Porky Pig, Popeye, Bugs Bunny, trouncing all these Arabs. And I thought, well, isn't this interesting? Cartoons vilifying Arabs in the mid-70s. So I asked our children, Michael and Michelle, if they would be so kind and document all of these images for their dear father. So on Saturday morning, I'd be having coffee with my wife, and I'd hear, "Daddy, Daddy," and I'd run downstairs, because at the time I didn't have a VCR, and I would start writing frantically about these cartoons. Well, today at the Tenement Library at NYU, you'll find literally dozens of children's cartoons which show the vilification of Arabs with Porky Pig, Bugs Bunny. I brought with me, I couldn't resist, one of the main offenders was Disney. And I just brought with me one visual. This is an old Disney 1947 cartoon called Crazy with the Heat, where you have the Arab with the scimitar trying to do away with Donald Duck and Goofy. And to date, my next book, if I have time to finish it, will do with the cartoon Arab, because I've documented more than 1,000 children's cartoons that in one way or another show the Arab as the evil enemy other. What's interesting about tonight is that this is not a session about one group of people or another. It's a session about the vilification of a people, of any group of people, and what goes into that vilification process. The sins of omission and commission. How you dehumanize a people by excluding their humanity, be they Asian or Arab. How you show only the negative attributes. You take a grain of sand, and in that grain of sand you take out all of the sort of like pieces that don't fit, and you say these pieces represent a people, and you turn it into a sandstorm. So that when you look at images of Arabs, you know, you have the terrorist, you have the sheikh, you have the boisterous bargainer, you have the women who are portrayed as being submissive. The politicians love to pick up on that, you know. Anthony Weiner's wife, Huma Abedin, I'm not quite sure. Yes, I think Rush Limbaugh, someone said, of course, you know, he's married to a Muslim, no wonder he gets away with all these things. Muslim women are submissive. And I thought to myself, really? It's new to me. And you could look at, you know, the role of Asian women. They're submissive, boisterous belly dancers, the sexual images, and so forth. So there are many commonalities, which I hope we'll get into during this discussion. And the other thing that I've always talked about with my students and here at NYU, and I must say I'm deeply grateful to NYU, Professor Tchen, and the people at the Kevorkian Center for accepting my collection and utilizing it and sharing it with students and faculty. It's a wonderful resource material. But getting back to the commonalities and the differences, when you vilify a people, innocents die. You compare Saddam Hussein to Hitler, it makes it that much easier to go to war in Iraq. Over and over again you repeat the same images of sameness, the sins of omission and commission. And so you dehumanize a people primarily by excluding family. In other words, an Asian or an Arab couple cannot be happily married. They can't have children. They can't go out on a picnic, okay? Because if you do that, if you see a family together, you know, going to McDonald's and having French fries, all of a sudden they become like us. And in order to make sure that never happens, you exclude family from the images. And you focus only on those grains of sand that portray a people and their culture as backward and barbaric. And a line that has been used over and over again, and we still hear it today, is those people do not value human life as much as we do. Whether it's the Jews being vilified during World War II as an excuse for the Holocaust, the Chinese for the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Japanese for the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II, blacks for the justification for lynchings, where white families could actually go to lynchings and have a picnic and enjoy themselves as young black men were being hanged. How does that happen? So history has all of these lessons for us. And our goal, our challenge is to really learn from those lessons. And I'm hoping that the dialogue that we have tonight will take us, you know, not only revealing the warts and the disturbing images and the consequences of those images, but possibly and hopefully some solutions as to how we can best shatter that mythology and move forward so that we can unite rather than sort of split ourselves apart and point and say, you people are not as humane as us, etc., etc., etc. So with that, I give you Professor Chen.
It's a delight to finally be on a panel talking about these issues. This is something that Dylan, Jack, Shaheen, and I have been going over for years and years and years, but really with the original collections, the films, the clips, the sound bits that we have, and we're now able to kind of talk about in public, so really delighted to have this opportunity. Let me just tell you a little bit about how this began for me, and then we'll talk about maybe some of the connections, and Dylan and I are going to do a little tag team here with our time. I was the first one in my family born in this country. My parents were refugees, and I found myself growing up in the prairie of outside of Chicago, watching black and white TV and seeing Flash Gordon and Fu Manchu films and Charlie Chan films, and I could not figure out what was going on in this stuff. It just didn't make any sense to me. I couldn't figure it out. So I realized I must have been traumatized or something at that moment, because I've spent, I think, most of my life really trying to unpack this stuff and trying to make some sense of what was going on. So in some ways that meant that I'd be collecting tidbits and fragments from things that are just like in the air, floating, or comments that people would make, or things I would find in a used bookstore. And as a process, this kind of expanded. So I kind of expanded from looking at what happened to Chinese Americans, to also thinking about Japanese Americans, to also thinking about what happened in California with other Asian groups, and then to opening up to the Americas and thinking about the larger context, because Chinese were also excluded in Canada, and there are all sorts of discriminatory actions towards other Asians. So this became a larger and larger project as time went on. So in some ways, this book, Yellow Peril, an archive of anti-Asian fear, is really something that has been the consequence of these decades of exploration. It got me sensitive to the fact that we have to collect this material because it is seen as ephemeral. It's seen as not something that exists. It's not something talked about at large. It's not something analyzed in the news reports. When there's an instance of racial violence or profiling or saber rattling justifying a war, people are not automatically also looking at the history of these images, and therefore the kind of visceral reactions that in some ways we've become conditioned to in American society, in terms of sounds, in terms of looks, smells, attitudes. All of these things kind of come. So this book is kind of a Reader's Digest. It's kind of a Cliff Notes, looking at this phenomenon not only from kind of the sweet spot that we tend to think of in terms of the Chinese Exclusion Act and Japanese American incarceration into concentration camps in the United States, but also looking back deeper to find out what might be some of the roots of this. And we went really quite far back. So you'll kind of see that surprise in this book. But also we brought it forward, and we'll be talking about some of these things. Let me just say briefly, and then I'll pass it over to Dylan. In the collection process, of course, there are a lot of visuals, and I thank Sewell for doing this, but also for noting this. I think in the world of journalism, we are thinking of words and images. I mean, that's really what we deal with in electronic media. But certainly, sounds and smells and the sense of a touch are also deeply communicated, right, in terms of ideas of Oriental otherness. And when I use the word Oriental, of course we're talking about not just so-called Far Easterns, which is always geographically very confusing, right, to school children to this day. The Far East, meaning Japan, China, Korea, maybe the Philippines. We're not sure how the Philippines fits in. So American kind of sense of what's East and West is very confusing. But of course it's East from the point of view of Europe. And then the Middle East, or the Near East, we're also seen as Orientals, and Jews, for that matter, were seen as Eastern European, but they were also seen as Orientals. Right? So this category of Oriental is actually quite significant. And there's not only this word of Oriental and the look of Oriental, but also the sound of something Oriental. So I actually brought a little fun thing for you to listen to. It's actually a 1930 sound bit from a cartoon that's called Laundry Blues, and this is the very beginning of Laundry Blues. And I wish we could show the video, but you'll go home and take a look at this. It's the opening in a Chinese laundry, and it's cats and mice, as a laundryman with long pigtails, and this is the music that it starts with. Okay, you get the idea. This is the kind of thing I grew up with, and many of you did. But even if you're a new immigrant coming into this country now, this is part of the exposure of becoming an American. It's not the part that we tend to talk about, but it's part that you begin to acquire. It's a certain kind of cultural and historical literacy that people begin to gain. And it's not just knowing it in your brain and being tested for it. It's actually feeling a sense that with the gong and this kind of mincing music, that something Oriental and strange and exotic and different is going to happen. And that sets up a whole set of problems, because that can be seen as either benign or kind of comical, as in dancing cats and mice with pigtails, or it could be seen as something really dangerous and so un-American that we really have to be aware. And of course, we're talking about that whole range of responses that happen. And it's really a visceral response. It's almost like a programmed response. It's not just about a rational kind of, I'm now hearing this and this and that. It's not that. So the book is about that, and we also think of the collections as about that. So we want to kind of encourage all of you to be kind of digging through your papers and archives and things that you've noticed and see in bookstores, and begin to kind of develop a Yellow Peril kind of collections project at large, because we need to make this understanding palpable. And it's really to build on the incredible work that Jack has done and other people who have collected. So Dylan's going to talk a little bit about his background.
Yeah, thank you. It's really a thrill to be here, and thanks everyone for coming out. I'm asked a lot why I've worked so long on projects like this, because as you may be able to tell, I'm not Asian American, and therefore in theory not the sort of subject to the malicious nature of some of these stereotypes. And I actually started getting involved in this stuff because I almost randomly took a class with Jack in the spring of 2002.
It fit your schedule, right?
It fit my schedule. And I was like, I just moved to New York and was interested in New York history, figured I'd take his class, Chinatown and the American Imagination. And it really opened my eyes to an aspect of American history that I had not been familiar with before, which was really Asian American history generally. And I was really impressed with just how much mainstream American culture is obsessed with these types of images. And more than just obsessed is there's many decades and centuries of documentation about how whiteness in particular has been sort of defined against this fantasy Orientalness. And that was something that I hadn't really thought about before, and I think as my experience was similar to what many other people's are when they get into this material, which is it's both surprising and also not surprising, because as someone socialized in this society, it all sort of rings true, but we never really step out and reflect on what that means. And so over the last 12 years, I've been lucky enough to keep working with Jack on a variety of projects, learning more about Asian American history and getting more and more obsessed myself and sort of collecting it and analyzing it. And over that period of time, I sort of was learning about that as I sort of was watching the sort of implications of some of this form of thinking and the way in which these stereotypes and this tradition sort of has defined what Americans, particularly white Americans, think of themselves as. And the implications, as both Jacks have already suggested, are kind of scary. We've seen the erosion of our political and civil liberties. We've seen the rushes to war, excessive civilian collateral damage, and all sorts of other changes. And we watched sort of, Islamophobia kind of rise up. Not that it wasn't racism before, but it has taken on a much new valence in the last decade. And so that got me thinking about what is sort of latent in the mainstream American culture that can allow for people to be duped in this way. And as I was watching that in our country, I was also reading a lot of the early Asian American movement material, trying to connect racism here with U.S. foreign policy, and that argument makes sense all the way back in American history, where forms of domestic racism and stereotypes really profoundly affect the U.S. foreign policy in general, and the willingness to invade, or the willingness to allow for the deaths of less than human peoples. And so one of the things that we've been trying to do by gathering the material that we have in the book is to try to mine that culture and try to give a sense of its origins and genealogy and try to begin to analyze and think about it. And one of the key sort of threads of that that take up one of our chapters is this idea of the coming war. And I think it really illustrates one of the problems for all Americans, even if they don't think of themselves as the direct targets of these stereotypes, is that the worldview that it engenders is one in which there are people out to get us. They want what we have. It's a binary us versus them kind of mentality. And if you add on to that a notion of either American or white or Christian superiority, then in that context, as problems arise, as foreign policy fails or as economic policy fails, there's no room for introspection or self-reflection. There's only room for sort of scapegoating. And so when you set it up that way, I think it lends itself to the fabrication or the fixation on trying to blame somebody else. And we have a long history of blaming people that we think of as Eastern or Oriental that we are trying to sort of map in this book. And it shifts depending on different moments in time, but it's always their fault instead of our fault. And so I think that everyone should be invested in trying to self-reflect for themselves and promote analysis that sort of lowers the stakes of that contest, exposes it as a misunderstanding and sometimes a purposeful deception, so that we can look with fresher eyes and a shared humanity to actually address the problems that are really happening, instead of sort of hunting these phantoms.
Thank you for these very eloquent and thoughtful comments. I have questions, many questions actually, but I'll ask a few and then open it up to the audience. One of the fascinating things I've read about in Yellow Peril was that the term itself was actually coined by Kaiser Wilhelm. Obviously, 2014 is an important year, perhaps more so in other parts of the world, especially Europe, than here, because it marks the centenary of the start of World War I. And I was interested very, very much in how 1914 and a century ago was a period of empire. American empire, though not acknowledged, declining empires, the Ottoman Empire, which obviously had for more than 7 centuries controlled much of the Islamic world, was brought to an end, obviously, by the end of World War I. And the cartoon in particular that you selected, in which Kaiser Wilhelm, it's actually a depiction. Interestingly enough, I had thought that the term Yellow Peril, I thought it had to do. I just assumed surely it had to do with anti-Asian immigrant sentiment in the United States in the 19th century. Not at all. It's an early 20th century depiction, and it actually relates to the Japanese expansion that was going on at the time in East Asia as a result of its industrialization and modernization, and what that meant for, at the time, a very ailing China that was at the risk of perhaps political collapse, fragmentation, and conquest. So I wanted to ask each of you, to what extent are these images wrapped up in projects of empire and state building?
Well, I think it's directly connected. I mean, there's a great quote about Abraham Lincoln saying how much public opinion matters in the United States. And when we go to war, I mean, particularly the recent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, it was easy primarily because for decades we had perceived Arabs and Muslims as subhumans, not as the Yellow Peril, but as the Green Menace, as the once we perceived, the Red Menace. It sort of segued into the Green Menace. And it's what amazes me still is that so many people think that politicians are immune to these images, and that journalists with integrity are immune to these images. That's not true. These stereotypes, once they are embedded in our psyches, function as a poisonous virus. And it's very, very, very difficult to get rid of them. And they escalate, and you use the stereotypes as a justification to advance the goals of the empire or whomever.
Yeah, I would agree completely. And you can check out in the book the image that Sewell's referring to, but there are different allegorical angels that each represent a European country, and the Archangel Michael is sort of trying to rally them together, and on the horizon is this Buddha riding a dragon, sort of threatening across the valley. And the
conquering Buddha.
Right. And
not the contemplative one.
And I think it perfectly encapsulates this point, because what the Kaiser was trying to do is argue that the European nations shouldn't be fighting each other over who's going to control China. They should unite together to keep Japan out of China. And he did that in part because Germany was going to be on the losing end of that. So this was an appeal to a common Christianity and whiteness to advantage Germany's access to Chinese markets and territory. And so I think these images are very much connected. If you don't mind, I'd like to just show this book, just because you mentioned World War I. This is actually a book called The Rising Tide of Color, which was written by an American eugenicist named Lothrop Stoddard, and the preface is from the president of the American Museum of Natural History. This was an incredibly popular book, and you can see that there is a sort of Arab with a rifle, and then a sort of Chinese or Asian figure, and then an African, and they're rising up. And okay, sorry, I'm not very good with microphones. And what Stoddard actually says is that the only victor of World War I was Japan, because it exposed to the colonized people of the world that the whites were not actually in control, and that they were not superior, and that Japan was going to unite all the colonized people to overthrow European colonialism, and that was going to be terrifying, and that those peoples were going to come back and punish and do to the Europeans what the Europeans had done to them. Now, Japan was actually funding many of the anti-colonial movements across the globe, and we don't here ever think about that that history, that how important colonialism was for the world and how much it affected the cultural products that were created. But the response then, and I think this goes back to this point about the impact on fantasies of the West generally, is this pervasive fear that the colonizer can come and punish, and that setup makes any appeal for human rights or justice or freedom sound like an affront, to the very survival of the West itself. So I think that these are very much wrapped up in that.
A central figure in the opening of our book is the dangerous, the insidious Dr. Fu Manchu. And Fu Manchu has kind of receded in the American imagination, but I really do want to encourage you to kind of look at the many thousands and millions of books that are out there. You can pick them up for very little money at any used bookstore, but also to watch The Mask of Fu Manchu, not so much to revel in it and to believe it, but to see really how these stereotypes have played out. And first of all, Fu Manchu was seen as evil incarnate, and he had the advantage of Western education. And he was also a medical doctor, so he had studied at Cambridge, Oxford, and also Harvard. And he was this...
All the more menacing.
Yeah, all the more menacing, right. And of course, in some ways, he was a model minority, right? He achieved very well, right? But then, of course, he went over to the dark side because he was affronted, right? Now, Sax Rohmer was a pseudonym of Arthur Ward, who actually authored the piece. Was a British kind of local color writer. And once he saw the headlines for the Boxer Rebellion that was happening in China, where China was reacting to all sorts of issues, but among them, the missionaries in China and the foreign incursions in China, the foreign occupation of treaty ports in China. And there's a rebellion, and a number of Westerners were killed in that, including some missionaries. That hit the headlines hugely all over the Western world, certainly in the British Empire. And that reaction gave him the sense that there's actually an audience out there to imagine some kind of inscrutable, omnipotent evil that was behind the Boxer Rebellion, but also any resistance to the expansion of European colonial powers into various parts of anywhere, but certainly Asia as well. So we see this kind of direct historical kind of connection. Now, the interesting thing about Fu Manchu is that, A, he has control. He's in The Mask of Fu Manchu, he's trying to recover the mask and sword of Genghis Khan. Right? And Genghis Khan is mentioned time and time again in all our various documents. So what is that about? And of course it's about the lightning raids that Genghis Khan and his various kinds of armies, were able to sweep throughout Central Asia, but into the very doorstep of Europe. Right? And that the nomadic peoples have always been a threat to any kind of settled city-state or settled nation. So there's that. But also the image in Fu Manchu was that the hordes, the faceless hordes, all wearing different kinds of costumes from Hollywood, right? You can just, they took all the different kinds of costumes from all the different movies of Arabs and Chinese and Japanese, and they threw them all together on top of these extras, right? And these are the dangerous hordes that Fu Manchu controls. And by having the authority of Genghis Khan, then the hordes will be revived, and they're going to conquer London, and then who knows where else after that, right? The other part of this, which is actually quite indicative, I think, and quite dangerous, is that the death ray that Fu Manchu has, this electronic ray, is used not against the West, but Sir Nayland Smith and his little band of intrepid heroes are able to commandeer this death ray and basically shoot it down on these hordes in the banquet room and kill everybody right away. So it's really a weapon of mass destruction. So these ideas are deep, deep, deep in the culture.
I want to ask a slightly provocative question, if I may. Is there a little bit of a danger in each of your projects in collapsing across much time and space an incredibly diverse array of negative and derogatory images? And I ask that to give two examples. Upstairs in this in the permanent exhibition here, you'll see that famous Life magazine spread, right? That during World War II, this magazine had to distinguish the evil Japanese, who were America's foes, from the friendly Chinese, who had become suddenly our allies. And this attempt to kind of turn and delineate these kind of, how do you tell friend from enemy? Similarly, we see in the Middle East that foreign policy is often turned on a dime. We often forget that Iranians, who are not Arabs, of course, that their relations with America have changed dramatically over the years. That relates to the overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953, the installation of the Shah, his subsequent overthrow in 1979. These images do wax and wane over time. They're not entirely stable. How in your projects do you account for that waxing and waning, and what do you attribute it to?
Well, I can speak to the Arab images. We used to have initially the Bedouin bandit. I mean, we talk about, Jack just talked about faceless hordes. It was always the Bedouin bandits attacking the Legion fort. The legionnaires were going to civilize the Arabs. And that sort of faded into the landscape. I also want to mention the African hordes in the Tarzan movies, of course. They were there. And, of course, the cowboys and Indians, the similarities there with the Indians wearing these, attacking the cavalry in the fort. It's all the same. It's just different costumes, but the plot is the same. And then it evolved. You used to have early on, I think, the Arabian Nights fantasies, but you never had early on the characters like Jafar, and Aladdin. You didn't have songs like, "Oh, I come from a land from a faraway place," where the caravan camel roams, where they cut off your ear if they don't like your face. It's barbaric, but hey, it's home. I mean, that, and I remember talking to...
And this is the 90s.
This is the 90s. And I remember talking to Jeffrey Katzenberg and some people at Disney that didn't think anything was wrong with this song, but that's another story. And why were we complaining? And then it evolved primarily with the oil embargo, the image of the sheikh. Instead of it being just a sloppy, chubby guy with harem maidens that he couldn't please because he was rather impotent, it became the sheikh who was financing terrorism. And then all of a sudden the Palestinians took on an identity of all Palestinians equal terrorists. And then again, as the political landscape changed, as early, 40 years ago, there was a movie called Adventure in Iraq, where Iraqis were portrayed as devil worshippers. And then you had Islam, particularly after 9/11, taking on the role where it would be the Islamic fundamentalists, and American Muslims hiding out in mosques, designed to hurt us, to injure us. So I think that technology, number one, and world events, number two, altered those images, but persistent throughout, always were the Asian as the evil enemy other, the Arab as the evil enemy other, with exceptions in the, that's a great question, with exceptions in the images, that we see, that are conveyed.
Dylan was talking about this kind of latency that exists. In other words, a lot of these images are kind of almost like a data bank that are there. And in any given historical moment, one group that might be considered evil, and another group considered good, Japanese, Chinese, different groups, Koreans, whatever, then can be shifted very quickly. So you're talking about this flipping is actually quite important. But what's undergirding it is a kind of racialization of not being able to distinguish one group from another. So if these groups are tagged to be bad one moment and suddenly good another moment, but they all appear to be phenotypically from the appearance to be some kind of Asian, they're kind of foreign looking, we can't tell the difference, then in fact these foreign policy, trade policy, can be immigration policy can be manipulated very quickly and very easily, depending on whether Henry Luce of Time Life is feeling that because he grew up in China as a missionary and wanted to kind of reverse the image of Chinese against Japanese, if he was there at that moment and had the power to make that kind of impact, he would then perhaps weigh in. So it's both historical, but also these racializations in some ways are almost there in various kinds of configurations, both so-called good and bad, but a lot of it is tied to this idea of racial and sexual threat. The pattern that Jack talks about is of the evil non-white male who is so different and gruesome looking that they're really dangerous and they're a threat to white womanhood. So the gendered and sexual threat is actually a key part that makes it all the more powerful, especially in times of war.
Go ahead.
Well, yeah, no, I would just say that I think that the pop cultural representations need to be somewhat plausible given the current geopolitical moment, but even if you look around, it's often a very tenuous connection because, like Jack said, people are essentially, the mentality is there, so it doesn't matter so much who the actual target is at any one moment because people are kind of prepared that there is an evil plot and it's just a question of the specifics that are coming. And what we tried to do with the book, which is vast and only skims the surface and is supposed to be largely inspirational so that people can kind of fill in, follow whatever leads they want, fill in the blanks for themselves and just get a sense of how much material there is, but also how much existing scholarship there already is that hasn't been sort of synthesized so much, but is available, and that's part of what we want to show. But we wanted to kind of suggest that there's a tradition that is being created and recreated generation to generation. There's I think in the United States we could say there's an actual political tradition of coming up with scapegoats, whether that's the communists or the terrorists, whether or not it's the East Asian embrace of capitalism or rejection of capitalism. Any of those are used for political purposes here, and then that's a decades-long tradition that people follow in, and then also in terms of creating a fantasy of Western civilization, there's a tradition there too. So I think what's important about thinking of it as a tradition is that it sets up a set of institutions and a set of practices and a set of assumptions that as the world shifts and can no longer accommodate that. I think, at least historically looking at the United States after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a real scramble to figure out how to justify the military buildup, and the think tanks found lots of potential enemies to fill that gap. But so there's a certain layering that happens over time. The good news is that if it's a tradition, as opposed to some sort of inherent characteristic of some imagined American personality, then we can change the tradition and we can dismantle it by acknowledging that there's this sort of pattern. And so I think that's what we're trying to do.
So, off Dylan's point, it gets to my next question. Next year, 2015, will mark the 50th anniversary of the 1965 reforms to the Immigration and Nationality Act, which really overhauled the nature of American immigration policy. And certainly one of the facts of America today is the great heterogeneity of American society. Unlike 100 years ago, there are substantial Arab American and Asian American groups that will speak up in response to negative, defamatory, malicious, or other images. And so I wanted to ask, historians rarely like to say whether things are getting better or worse, but I would like to press a little bit on that question. We are at a time, we're at a distinctive historical moment. I mean, anyone who's been to metropolitan Detroit, or for that matter, Brooklyn, cannot help but understand the great variety of the Arab American experience here. And yet there's profound ignorance. Many people are unaware that Arabs are not synonymous with Islam, that the most populous Muslim country in the world is Indonesia, not in the Middle East, that Kurds, for example, or Persians are not Arabs, nor are Turks. And you get so that ignorance persists. And yet at the same time, you've seen Arab Americans rise to the highest levels, some of the highest levels of political office, certainly members of the Senate. You've seen that on the Asian American side as well. Are things getting better?
Yes and no. I think certainly in the cinema, there are fewer major films today that vilify Arabs than there were 10 years ago. I think it's gotten much worse in two fronts. And I'm worried, I'm concerned, actually. One is television, with series that all started right after 9/11, with series like 24, and even now to some extent Homeland, that portray Arab Americans and Muslim Americans as terrorists. We had nothing whatsoever to do with 9/11 and the focus on the mosque. I mean, I'm an Arab American Christian, but on Hilton Head Island, you'd be amazed at how many people think I'm Muslim. So I just say, yes, I would be nice to have a mosque here on the island. And then there's silence. So I think until the time comes when I make that statement, and someone responds, yes, it would be nice. We've got some great synagogues, we have Presbyterian churches, Catholic churches, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It'd be great if we had a mosque here on the island. But television, I find, has continually hammered home this myth. And, if I may be so bold to say, Fox News and Republican candidates for president have used Islamophobia as a means, and special interest groups like the Clarion Fund have used Islamophobia as an excuse to create fear in the hearts and minds of many Americans. And those organizations like the Clarion Fund, Fox, I'd love to have a one-on-one with Bill O'Reilly, not at Fox News, here, in a neutral place. I welcome that, Bill, if you're watching. Or Joe Scarborough, because Scarborough is just as guilty. Or what's the guy who runs Hardball? Chris Matthews. And these men have gone out of their way to say horrific things about America's Muslims and Arabs. And I think the fact that the rhetoric, we talked about words, that the rhetoric goes uncontested and no one really challenges these, to some extent, these bigoted comments, concerns me, in spite of the fact that there is this heightened awareness.
But is that quite true now? George Allen's Senate candidacy in Virginia was nearly derailed when he infamously referred to a South Asian American person as a macaca. We have Republican governors of Louisiana and South Carolina of South Asian ancestry. One is a Catholic, Bobby Jindal. The other, Nikki Haley, is Sikh by ancestry. The shifting, and she appointed an African American senator, a conservative Republican.
I think it's different with
It's shifting.
Asian Americans than it is with Arab Americans. Not so much Arab Americans, Muslim Americans. I think I think Muslim Americans are under the microscope much more. It's different for them. It really is.
And did the election of Barack Hussein Obama, whose father was Muslim, worsen that in your view?
I think the president, with all due respect, and I'm a supporter of the president.
And the only president to have lived in a predominantly Muslim country during his childhood in Indonesia.
The president, at some point before he steps down, should say 25-30% of the American people think I am a Muslim. What if I were? So what? What difference would that make? He's not said that, and he needs to say that. And if I were having coffee with him, I would encourage him to say that. I mean, because by not saying it, it allows this sort of rhetoric. But you're right about the Asian. I mean, I think the Asian American community, with all due respect, is much more organized and really does a much better job than we do.
To follow up very quickly, though, does George W. Bush deserve some credit for the statement he made immediately after 9/11?
A tremendous amount of credit. I applaud him in my book, Real Bad Arabs, How Hollywood Vilifies a People. He really, that speech right after 9/11 was beautifully done by President Bush.
I guess I'd like to put this question in a historical context in which these changes don't happen automatically. They actually happen because these groups start entering into American life more and more. So if we talk about Irish or Jews or other groups, it's been a process. When Irish and Jews were thought to be non-white, it really took them entering in to different areas of American culture and politics to basically contest, bit by bit, piece by piece, these stereotypes and these exclusions and these attitudes. It took a long time. A long time. So these changes don't happen intrinsically because, somebody says, I'm sorry, I did that to you, I shouldn't have done that. They're actually structured into power relationships and vested interests. And it takes the pushback in all these different arenas for the change to happen. So I would say that, in part, to answer your question, now that there's been increasing deracialization and desegregation, it's really been a consequence of the pushbacks, of people really organizing around it. And I'm not saying it was only Asian Americans who fought for opening up Asian Americans. It's actually African Americans really made the difference for Asian Americans. But also someone like Emanuel Seller, who was a congressman from Brooklyn, he was the co-sponsor, he was the author of that 1965 Immigration Reform Act. So it really takes this kind of coalition of people of really kind of critically saying that these immigration laws are not right. He was critical, Emanuel Seller was critical of the 1924 Immigration Act, which basically was a consequence of the eugenics movement. It said that it was Nordic Europeans who should be the ones who get the most opportunity to come to this country. Eastern, Southern European immigrants, after Asians had already been excluded from this country and greatly limited, these were the groups that were causing racial degeneration. After 1924, now Americans don't think about this law, but it had a huge impact on all cities, all parts of the country. So Emanuel Seller was really also understanding the connection between anti-Jewish, anti-Eastern European, anti-Southern European racism, and linked it to really saying that there has to be a fairness across the board for different groups. So the pushback is really, I think, how change actually it has begun to happen on different kinds of levels.
A question for Jack Shaheen. You were a consultant on the film Syriana, and I found that quite surprising. It was a very complex film. I will not ask you about what it was like to work with George Clooney, although I'd like to. But you did choose to work in a film where the central theme ultimately is the threat, possible or actual, of radicalized religious fundamentalism and militancy. How did you grapple with that, and why did you decide to work on that project?
Well, I worked on the project primarily because they asked me, and because I felt I could make a difference in the screenplay, and because I had a tremendous amount of respect for the director-writer, Stephen Gagin. Had you seen the screenplay before? The screenplay, when I first read it, I thought nothing could be done to save this particular film. My wife did not want me to consult on the film. I remember sitting with Mr. Gagin in L.A. After I had... Clooney called, by the way, to ask me to consult. I didn't think it was him. I thought my wife was yanking my chain. So I picked up the phone. Sure, George, how are you? Everything okay? And and he asked me primarily because of the work that I had done on Three Kings. And I couldn't say no to him. But what impressed me about Gagin is I remember I sat down and I said to him, I said, Mr. Gagin, I said, I don't want a Muslim American family or an Arab American family to see this film and to walk out of the theater ashamed of their faith or their roots. And I said, would you kindly take that into consideration during the editing process? And I remember I sent him, and it's all over in the archives at the Tenement Library, I don't know, detailed notes as to what was wrong and what should be done to, in my opinion, to make it a more even-handed film. And when I was out in LA, remember my wife was in the audience, I got a call from Gagin's office. And he said, we have the film ready for you to see. And I remember looking at my wife and my family and saying, oh no, dear God, I have to see this film. And then I went and I sat in the screening room. I was the only one there. They took me off somewhere in Santa Monica. I sat down, there was a projectionist, no one else. And I watched the film and I almost cried because so many offensive scenes had been omitted from the film. And I remember Gagin came in and he said to me afterwards, what did you think? And I said, I can't talk. I need 5 minutes. Please leave me alone. And he walked out, the poor guy. And then he came back and he said, would you please tell me what you think? And I hugged him. And he said, let's go have steak.
That's very...
So it's a two-way street.
Yeah.
Stephen Gagin deserves a tremendous amount of credit.
That's a very inspiring story.
And a question for Dylan and for Jack Tchen. I can't help but notice there's a book right here entitled Red China's Fighting Hordes. What period is this from? It's from the
during the Korean War.
So the early 1950s, again, a period of enmity between the New People's Republic and the United States. I couldn't help but notice at the back of the book it says withdrawn. So some library deemed it unworthy of retaining it. I want to ask a little bit about the politics of shame. Only I think in the recent decades, for example, have images, for example, of lynchings been really kind of studied very, very closely as kind of not only kind of social documents, but also documents that are worth in some ways reproducing in exhibition catalogs, obviously in very, very somber ways. But in assembling this material, I guess especially for Jack Tchen, I'd like to ask this question. Did you encounter a certain kind of reluctance among people who were like, well, why would you collect this stuff? Let's just forget about it. Let's just withdraw it.
Well, it's a very interesting question because when we collect this stuff, in part, it's been kind of forgotten and hidden away. People have become embarrassed by it, which is terrific. That does show some change. At the same time, the underlying patterns that are there are also still there. So that some of the more blatant characterizations and caricatures and racist imagery may have kind of subsided and be put away. But in fact, the enactment of how fear operates or how anxiety gets scapegoated or paranoia gets expressed, those patterns are actually still very much there. And they get triggered at different moments. For example, recently I just got an email saying that UCLA and USC students have been organizing against racial slurs on their campuses. And that's, first of all, it's unusual for any two campuses to get together and to agree to do that. But these slurs we can see also as ephemeral, somehow not that significant. But I think the students were very aware that there's some deeper kind of attitudes that are in the slurs themselves. So it may not take necessarily a visual form, but it could be in other forms that then erupt and then actually play a very toxic role on these campuses. So these things are kind of there, and they're under the ground, kind of in the air, and when a moment strikes, they actually have a powerful force. I think the goal here as with any kind of toxin, is to kind of bring it to the surface so that we can begin to deal with it and begin to acknowledge it, begin to understand it and talk about it, and to detoxify it. So I think that's the strategy with why these collections are actually quite important. Of course, they need to be cared for in the right context, and we hope that by having the yellow octopus and an archive of anti-Asian fear, that people are not somehow going to mistake that as, oh, we're just trying to promote this kind of propaganda that has existed. I think people are really quite amazed to see the kinds of patterns that we begin to find across different time periods, traditions that were not really understood or known about. So by actually making them palpable, we can actually begin to kind of understand actually what's going on.
Thank you. Very thoughtful. I could continue asking questions all evening, I suspect, but I would like to open this up to this wonderful audience here at the Museum of Chinese and America, and to see if we have some questions for our distinguished panelists. The lady in the back, please. Is there someone who can help with the microphones? Thank you so much.
Good evening. This question's for Jack. So Fu Manchu doesn't really mean anything to me. I didn't grow up watching it, so I'm just curious about what other contemporary shows or images that's, I don't watch that much television, but what's out there that really promotes this negative image? I certainly hear a lot of political rhetoric, especially after the financial crisis and all these manufacturing jobs moving to China, about fear-mongering, about how China's taking over. But what are some of the contemporary images in the media that portrays us in a negative light?
Well, the image may shift from group to group, and I have a feeling some people in the audience may have some thoughts about this. Let me just give two examples. One is the remake of the film Red Dawn that came out a few years ago, which started out, it's a remake of a film. Who were the original enemies? I'm trying to remember.
The Soviets.
The Soviets were dropping into some middle American town and kind of surprising America and basically taking over. This remake started out with basically Chinese dropping into a Colorado town, I believe, and it's really the young men who saved the town from this horrible technological invasion where all the computers and electronics were wiped out through some new insidious device. With the pushback from China, which now, of course, has a very large market share of the global kind of media market, but also owns a lot of American theaters, they said, no, we don't like this, for understandable reasons. And they shifted the bad guys, they recut it, so that they were the North Koreans who invaded the country.
It's easy when you choose the most isolated country on earth.
Yeah. So for a cheap fix, they made a different enemy. But in some ways, it's a good example of how the evil enemy shifts very quickly. And we can cite many, many other examples.
I want to add to that. There's a very good example. There's a wonderful book about Nazi cinema by Thomas Doherty. And he writes about how Hollywood kept doing business with Nazi Germany almost right up until World War II began, primarily for economic reasons. They did not want to lose the German audiences, and would make compromises with the German consulate or the German consul who was based in LA, basically letting him censor these films. So when you think of that and you think of this, it's all linked together. It's the same. They may be different people, but the rationale behind it, the motivations, the economic thrust is there. And that's one of the reasons, again, why collections such as these are so important.
Another question. Why don't we go here, and then we'll move back to this side.
Yeah, I guess underlying the propaganda that goes on with the Yellow Peril is the fact that it makes the victims into the criminals. The reality is that the United States, as well as other European powers, with the dominant colonial power, it just doesn't look good that we're the ones who are victimizing the third world. The third world has to victimize us in order to justify these actions. So I think that's the theme, that's the underlying theme, like the North Koreans or the Chinese invading the United States. Historically, it's the other way around. Korea was divided by the United States. The division was created by the United States and may have caused the creation of a Stalinist government as a result. But the fact is, it's our government, other colonial powers are creating the problems. So I think that's the thing that we have to address. I think the American people have to be aware of that. Of course, the media shows otherwise. So I think for us as the American public, we have to really address those issues as really fundamentally critical. Because as we know, as you stated earlier, development of the capitalist Chinese alternative to the third world is what the United States is really opposed to. So we're going to see unfortunately, a larger presence in Asia. And I know my father, he was here during the Korean War, and he was harassed. And that scenario can happen again. So it's something to take a look at.
Thanks for that observation. We have two questions. Why don't we go here first, then this gentleman, and then you.
Maybe it's more of a comment, but maybe you guys can sort of add to the question I have, is that, you know, the pushback of Asian Americans being engaged in political life in America have led the firmament not to engage in these blatant sort of like stereotypes. But to me, the most insidious sort of iteration of these are these sophisticated images that we don't see. And I came out of Pacific Rim actually thinking about that when I saw that last year, because I thought, this is a movie that takes place in Hong Kong. There's no Chinese character. It's this guy named Tchen or something that's an arms dealer or something, and he's white. So it's kind of very interesting about what the images and the pushback have engendered, which is a very sophisticated iteration of that, to say, it's Pacific Rim and the white people will take care of this. You know, there's a Chinese team in there, but they get knocked out really quickly. You know, so to me, that movie in many different ways shows me the most modern iteration, where I came out of it like completely steamed, and my friends were like, "You're crazy, man." You know, and I'm like, "Do you realize what that film just told you? You know, that we're gonna need these people to come save us." It takes place in Hong Kong, in Asia, and you know, and there's many other things about the movie. So to me, this is so important as a record of what came before and what's no longer politically acceptable within the larger discussion. But the most dangerous thing is the most sophisticated iterations, the things that underpin, that make their way into our films today, that we might not even notice. Because it's no longer saying negative things about somebody, it's about something very positive about one group, and about what their responsibilities are.
Your sense of omission, as Shaheen put it. This gentleman at the end of the row had a question, I believe.
Peace. I haven't read Yellow Peril, and I don't really have a question, it's sort of rebuttal. I passed by not knowing that this place even existed. You know, I live in Harlem, so as a young black man, my filter is, you know, completely different, or possibly just unique, in that when I think of racism, it's simply an extension of a Eurocentric ideal. And it's easy to compartmentalize, you know, this Arab or you know, these racism dynamics, or whatever you want to call them. But what caught my eye was the word xenophobia, and that's the only reason I stopped. And I came across xenophobia by way of Napster. Thank God for Napster. And when I was 15, I got my first computer, and I downloaded a lot of free music. And there was one lecture by Noam Chomsky, and he was giving an explanation of blaxploitation movies, and he put the context of blaxploitation movies in the proper context, and I've always carried with me. And he said that blaxploitation movies were, as he phrased, necessary illusions. So that's what I think of when I think of what I've heard today. I think that these are necessary illusions, sort of in an archetypical fashion that one can align themselves to, and that they are powerful, and that they can resonate with us, regardless of how bad they seem, that they are real forces that generate realities, and that will definitely hurt or harm, or however you want, you know, kill people.
Before moving to the next question, if I could ask quickly, following on this question, on this observation, very, very perceptive. 12 Years a Slave is obviously a very, very important film right now, and generating a lot of discussion and perhaps controversy about America's painful past. But one thing about depictions of African Americans has been that, at least since the Civil War era, the citizenship or the belongingness to the American polity, whether that belongingness was adequately represented or acknowledged, leaving that aside, there isn't the same element of kind of the xenophobic, the foreign versus the native. So could you elaborate a little bit
and
on
also I want to say one more thing.
Please.
The word America, it's hard for me to consider myself American, because America is such an ambiguous word. And I think as we move forward in this conversation, but what is America?
I would like for the Eat Book Preach project, though, to comment a little bit about what you studied and how you compare that to the very troubled history of images of African Americans.
Well, I can only say that I just read a review by a book dealing with the band leader back in the 20s, Paul Whiteman. And one of the quotes is, "Jazz was brought to America 300 years ago in chains." So there was a heightened awareness by some white musicians way back then as to the prejudices that existed. I think the African American experience probably, and what I'd love to do sometime, is to put together a class. We should do this on the most racist films in the history of cinema, the top 10.
Still competition.
Well, but the one that's at the very top, and the one that you can use to compare similarities with all of these images, is The Birth of a Nation, the D.W. Griffith film, where blacks are portrayed as subhuman beings. That film, in terms of its imagery, in terms of its political effect, in that it brought about the reemergence of the KKK, where the Ku Klux Klan, all of a sudden, which was diminishing in its membership, et cetera, et cetera. This is one film brought out more and more men in white sheets, which obviously caused more problems in the South and more deaths of Arab Americans. And this is a film that that Woodrow Wilson saw and never said a word about the racism, because it was produced by a good friend of his that he went to college with, who had written a book called The Klansman. So I think, in terms of the images, particularly in the past, if you look at the images of African Americans and you take Asians, Jews, Arabs, and others, and you use Birth of a Nation as an example, and to build on that, I think there are lots of similarities, particularly the political consequences that happen with the demonization process.
Jack, Chen, or Dylan?
Yeah, or you go ahead.
Well, I think there are, of course, a lot of different differences in some of the ways that African Americans have been depicted, but I think that there's also a lot of connections that we often miss. So, for instance, during World War II, people who wore zoot suits and a lot of critics of American white supremacist and segregationist policies were tagged as pro-Japanese sympathizers. Some of them actually did support Japan's rhetoric against imperialism and against white supremacy. And a lot of that story has been sort of forgotten, but that was used to then make African Americans who were advocating against segregation enemies of the state, essentially. And then the same thing, of course, happened in the 60s and 70s, where the threat of communism or third world liberation movements was used to also tarnish and spy on and imprison civil rights activists and anti-war activists. And of course, all that architecture of state surveillance that accompanies fears of subversion is used equally against against minority communities as well as Muslim communities. So I think they're all actually a lot more connected. And what we wanted to do is try to show how this tradition is connecting everyone in different ways, and everyone has to deal with it together, I guess.
I'll just try to be quick because we're raising lots of very important issues. One quick point is that oftentimes now films and how they vary and make more complex representations is by having three characters. Often, let's say an African American cop, a white cop against an evil Asian, who is automatically seen de facto as foreign. So that in some ways it can be seen as not racist because you have the two white-black buddies who are working together against the common enemy. So we're talking about triangulation in which otherness operates in very complicated ways, in which sexuality, gender roles, all of these things come into play. So that's one quick point. We could talk about lots of films that do that, and you can imagine lots of films that do that. The other point is I really appreciate your point about illusions, because really the point of all this, I think Jack would agree, although we've not talked about it, is that we're really talking about how can we deal with this world of illusions that we kind of live in and we viscerally respond to, and critique it enough so that we can actually deal with the real issues that are in front of us. We are facing profound social, global issues, interrelated issues about climate change, about the well-being of the great majority of people are increasingly poor, and the disparity between wealth and poverty. Right? So, how can we get to deal with those issues? How can we get to deal with the sustainable energy kinds of questions? How can we deal with the fact that in the Pacific Ocean there's this horrific Pacific gyre in which all the bottles of plastic we throw out end up in this gyre and they disintegrate and the fish eat them, and we're all becoming kind of plastic, in our bodies. They're opening up seabirds and they find all sorts of plastic inside of them. How can we deal with that if we're still stuck in these silos in a world of illusions, right? So that's really what's at stake here, is not to just, of course, in some ways watching these films is kind of crazy and amazing and like it's funny and to see these pull this stuff out. But really the stakes are how can we figure out how to talk with people who we perceived as so different from us that we can't even agree on standards for solar panels.
Very, very powerful. The lady in the front.
Thank you all for your years of work on these projects. I wanted to ask a question about the role or the position of women in your archives. And I don't mean to lump these different subjects together, but also non-heterosexual figures. And I ask that because when you're dealing with this sort of collectivist representation, these sorts of politics, the role of the woman gets subsumed to kind of domestic structure of the family. The issue of interracial romance arises as she becomes a betrayer of her race. And also, a way to identify racism is often to trace it to the emasculation of men. And negatively represents what femininity is all about in these contexts. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about how your projects deal with that figure.
Well, if we talk about Arab women, shorthand now, submissive objects. Either, they're in the desert getting water from the well, always subservient to the male, bosomy belly dancer, mostly mute most of the time. Occasionally, it started with a movie called Black Sunday. She became a terrorist. But almost always, there were some rare exceptions to that in some early Arabian Nights films where they were very strong women who really identified themselves and who said, I'll ride to Baghdad or I'll do whatever I have to do to save my father's life, and who would not be submissive, but they're very, very rare. Many commonalities, I think, with the images of Asian women, but totally, almost as bad, if not as bad, as images of the Arab now.
Yeah, well, of course, representations of gender are throughout all of this material and are a very central element of it. And so, but one interesting story that I think that we found that I think addresses this to some extent is in a lot of the early coming war novels that sort of that inspired Fu Manchu, the first of which was M.P. Shiel's Yellow Danger. In dozens of them, it is the white woman's rejection of an Asian student that compels him to decide to take over the world and and place revenge upon the continent that spurned him.
A disproportionate reaction.
Yeah, over and over and over again for 100 years. I mean, I can give you a list. And but I think that captures a lot of the dynamics at play, because on the one hand, the contest between East and West is often described as a contest over women, like many contests are imagined to be. And then it is the East's lack of masculinity that requires them to take revenge. And that's actually, I mean, even in today's terrorist studies journals, it's often described that, you know, these Islamic adherents are upset that their caliphate is not in control, and they're going to take out that masculine shame on the world by attacking people they imagine to be better men. And even in that formulation, which some of that is in the book, but there's lots of it around, is again a celebration of a fantasy Western masculinity that is so awesome that people can't handle it and need to attack it. Which brings up, I think, this question of queerness, which is haunting that the incredible straightness of the white man is making everyone else feel queer shame. But then, on the other hand, the other big thing that we see is that, and a lot has been written about this, particularly after 9/11, these domestic crises of what people imagine to be civilizational conflict are also used to try to strengthen the gender system in the United States. So after Pearl Harbor, in Time magazine, there was a famous essay by Luce, who was the editor, saying, now we should realize that we haven't been men enough to recognize this Japanese threat, and so let's set aside all this silly discussion of civil rights and equality and really man up to fight the Japanese. The same thing was said after 9/11. It was described as a crisis of masculinity. Now Susan Faludi wrote a book about the impact of that, and a lot of the conservative commenters were saying, can't we stop talking about feminism now that we're in a war against Islam? So I think that they're all deeply embedded within each other.
I almost forgot, excuse me for just a moment, Erica Young's book, which was praised by critics throughout the country. There's a chapter where she writes about Arab women, Arabs and other animals.
Is this Fear of Flying?
Yeah. Arabs and other animals. And even in the new edition, that chapter is there. And the one image I forgot to mention, she's someone else I'd like to have a cup of coffee with sometime, is the fact that if you see a movie, the movie Hidalgo, where there's this great desert race and a cowboy, we can't make cowboy and Indians movies anymore, so a cowboy goes to an Arab country with his horse to enter the great desert race. And not only does he win the great desert race, but the Arab heroine, this beautiful woman, says, you've got to win, otherwise I'll be forced to marry Sheikh Abdullah. And and we see Sheikh Abdullah. And so we're cheering, of course, for our cowboy hero to win the great desert race, so that the poor Arab woman, and that's a common theme in many, many films, that the Arab woman will go to the white protagonist and say, please rescue me from my Arab brothers.
I happen to believe that if you watch The Mask of Fu Manchu, all you need to know about everything will be in that film. So it's my reference for everything now. So that one of the triangles that you see is one white woman, and Myrna Loy, who's playing the daughter of Fu Manchu, the evil Fu Manchu, fighting over this tall, hunky white guy who is drugged by Fu Manchu and at one point is allured by Myrna Loy's Oriental wiles, who has kind of a sadomasochistic, kind of queer, non-normative kind of sexual desire. You know, she's kind of putting her fingernails on his, body and all this. And versus the white woman who truly loves him and is able to get him out of his drug stupor by expressing her pure love for this man. So you have two modes of sexuality, gender roles played off each other. Right? So again, there's another triangle. It's a different one than we talked about before, but it's very much there. And that's a lot of the dynamics that we're seeing, whether it's in the same film or played out in various films.
I think we have time for two more questions. Am I correct? This gentleman, and then we'll try to squeeze in three.
Thank you. I guess my question is related to your pushback idea, and if at any point in all of your, analysis of imagery, did you find pushback in that people who were being oppressed by these images were using the image, kind of inverting it, making it a power for themselves? Is there any...
Like reappropriating?
In a sense, yeah. And is that even possible given how loaded and negative these images are? Can you use this language as a form of power?
I think that is the classic American way it's done.
Rewrite the narrative.
And it requires, because it happens in the commercial culture, it's a little bit tricky, so that if we look at, let's say, some of the very early Irish playwrights who are here in New York City writing plays about Irish in Bowery theaters, they at first have to inhabit the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant stereotype of them. And then they have to explode it from within. But it depends on having paying customers who would then begin to come to their events. Now, when you're excluding Chinese from this country, you don't have that paying audience who can then act as a commercial counterforce, right? So we're talking about tricky types of Orientalism and otherness, which is at one moment commercial, at one moment political, at one moment patricians love, Oriental vases, quote unquote, Japanese or Chinese, and they think that Oriental merchants, so I'm using the word in quotes, are upright citizens who are just as good as Yankee merchants, right? So you have that going on. At the same time, in the commercial culture, you don't have the group being able to push back. Now we're in a different situation. This is the first time there's a chance to push back in the commercial culture, to unpack and challenge, inhabit, explode within those kinds of images. So that's in some ways the kind of where we're at right now.
Yeah, that's very, very striking when you think about, Al Jazeera America, when you think about how the, Hollywood movie studios have to cater to China, which is now one of the largest movie markets in the world. It's very, very interesting. Two more questions, I think. Yes.
Hi, it's actually related to the question from the gentleman. I'm thinking because the younger generation, either they were born in this country or the new immigrants from China, for them, some of the racist words have lost its historic context, like Chinchong. Like the lady back there, she didn't really know what's Fu Manchu. I don't either. So when these people now become the majority, and also when people like Rosie O'Donnell, she used the word Chinchong, when she used it, she didn't know it was biased. That was a few years ago. So when the person who said the word doesn't know what the word means, and the person who heard the word doesn't know what it meant either. Does that mean the word is not guilty anymore? Or is this something that you guys consider?
No, I think you take that.
I'll take it.
Yeah, take that.
It's a very good question, because some people would argue, well, that's progress. We don't know what it means anymore. But also we're still using it. So there's a kind of a strange paradox. I think part of becoming American in a weird kind of way is actually learning these things. Now, either you start using them in the derogatory way that they had been, or you begin to, in some ways, inhabit them in a different way. We've recently, some of you who have seen the newspapers know that one of our private high schools in New York City have put on Thoroughly Modern Millie. And they put on the Broadway version of it, not the original Julie Andrews film version of it, which was very virulently racist and showed lots of stereotypes, very negative stereotypes of Chinese, and opium dens and laundries and all that. The Broadway play musical was a little different and was meant to be satirical. And then now you have a high school, of very well-to-do high school, people paying as much money as $30,000, $40,000 a year for their students to go there, who decide to put on this play. The administration signs off on it. And in a weird kind of way, they are the example you're talking about. They don't know that these are stereotypes, but they're still part of the history of American theater and American society. Now, some of the parents who were from Asian backgrounds got very upset because even the satire of the stereotypes struck them as something very strange and odd. So we're talking about layers and boxes here in which we really, to be able to understand what's going on, we have to unpack it. And to the school's credit, there's going to be a panel talking about this. But in some ways, the process of becoming American is actually starting to learn these things, but not to simply not understand them and just repeat them, but to actually begin to engage with them and to really understand that history in some way.
No, I think to make the illuminations visible. Make them visible.
Very wise. We're pressed for time, so let's move quickly. Gentlemen, okay, in the sweater and then in the back.
So I wanted to go back to the book that you held up, the Lothrop Stoddard, Rising Tide of Color, and sort of this moment in history around World War I where there was this pervasive fear of exactly that, a rising tide of color, a united front of colonized peoples rising up to punish or colonize the colonizer. And I want to sort of link that to current rhetoric that's being thrown around in regards to the emergence of a majority-minority, sort of the fear that conservative America is holding on to in terms of, I think it's in 2042, for the first time, white Americans will no longer constitute the majority of the United States. And I wonder if you see this as sort of a new moment in which this fear of a rising tide of color is sort of emerging. And I also want to ask sort of whether this model of Jews and Italians and Irish folks who were not considered white assimilating into whiteness is applicable to this current context, and whether we can reasonably imagine that demographics that today we conceive of as being very clearly non-white, whether there is whether the malleability of otherness and whiteness is flexible enough to sort of take in new groups.
Well, I just worked as a consultant on the Super Bowl Coke commercial. And I remember the backlash that I received from my friends on the island, some of them, because they didn't like it because they were singing in different languages. And they just felt, why didn't they sing it in English? And so they missed the point. It wasn't malicious, they didn't like it. And we knew that when we were talking. If you see the 90-second spot, it begins, the Olympic ad begins with them saying, I am an American. Several groups or several people from different cultures say, I am an American. And that sort of sets it up a little better. But if you look at what happened in New York last year with Miss America, and how the Fox News president, Roger, what's his name, I won't speak his last name, was critical because of her background. Here he is, she's born in New York, and 3 years before that, Miss USA, an Arab American from Michigan. I mean, it's a problem. And at some point, I don't know what will happen, but hopefully the younger generation will kind of let the old folks fade out into the background and move forward in the right way. I think it's a minority, but it's a very vocal minority, and it's a very loud minority.
Yeah, well, I do think that this question of minority majority has already begun to instill fear similar to this in many people who are more invested in the status quo. I think it's been used for quite a long time now to try to argue as to why politicians of color are going to play favorites or going to punish. I think that fear of retribution from the people that from any marginalized group is interesting because it is an implicit recognition of how powerful racism is, and I think that we can use it in that way. I think that's one of the reasons for me that this work is relevant to everybody, even if they don't see themselves as that connected as targets to this material, because the fear of retribution is, I think, pervasive in America and is itself a form of analysis of just how stratified of a society we live in, and the guilt of that, which breeds fear, can't ever be resolved. And I think that's one of the reasons why inclusion into whiteness should not be the goal, because whiteness has expanded and contracted over the nation's history and has played a real role in giving some people advantage and prominence in our system. But it comes at the cost of being a relational identity that is inherently antagonistic because it's not equal. And so we can expand it, but I don't think that that's going to actually address the fundamental concerns, which are how to get at the root of what we're actually afraid of, which I think is inequality. So,
one final question from the back.
This goes to the future and sort of wrapping some of what the last few people asked, and Jack, what you had said about we've got all these unbelievably dire life and death issues on the planet, not just in our personal lives. I've been touring with another project around the country and talking to students and letting them talk about what it's like for them to be in this much more mixed community where you have to have dialogues. And some of you have to have dialogues because you're in the group, in the school, or you're in the college. And something that came up recently that I don't know how you would use your book or use these kinds of ways of looking backwards, but there's a Native American students, it's in the Northwest, who are in this college that traditionally there have not been a lot of Native Americans, and talk about really being hidden and wiped out in terms of how you're represented, that it came up around study groups. Who's going to sit with who? Who's going to study with who? Well, I'll work with the Chinese student because they're smart, but the Native Americans were saying people didn't want to study with them because of the assumption that they didn't have the intellectual chops to be that kind of partner. And it came up in this discussion of who gets listened to. And so I think maybe it came up early when either Sewell or Jack said something about the model minority student. And so going forward, not to get stuck totally in these are the negative stereotypes that people have been holding on to for a long time, how would you think of using some of this so that people can then start getting beyond that and listen to each other And certainly with race, I mean, what this young man said about being black in America too, and I travel with a black man, and we see how people respond to each of us when who opens their mouth to say what. Literally, like who gets listened to, in what way. And so maybe there's a way you can think of how those things could be used to open up a dialogue, not shut it down with more stereotyping.
One example, perhaps, is the work of Yuri Treisman, who worked with a mixed group of urban students, some African American, some Asian American, among others, in the class. And he noticed that the Asian American students were very good at math, which is a common stereotype. And then the African American students and some of the white American students were struggling. It might have been calculus, I can't remember what it was. And instead of simply accepting the stereotype that somehow these groups are essentially intelligent or inferior in these areas, he followed some of the students and asked them what their study habits were. And he began quickly to discover that the Asian American students thought it was perfectly fine to study together. And they actually learned from each other, and that's how they figured these problems out, right? Whereas the African American and the white American students were thinking, wait, that's cheating, you can't do that. We believe in individual intelligence and individual merit, so if we're studying with somebody else, we're somehow proving that we're cheating and borrowing from somebody else. Now, that seems to be a fundamental misunderstanding of really how we all learn. We all learn in a group social situation. So it suggests really that we are the only way this society, but also a group of people learning calculus, can really advance and learn calculus is by doing it together. And not just having the traditional teacher, lecturer, student, receptor, somehow memorizing and somehow either being inferior or better, but actually learning from each other, and that's really where I think a lot of the future is going to be.
I'd like to ask one final question to end this very, very exciting and insightful evening. Many of the images that are in these two books are very ugly and images that we would prefer, many of us would prefer to turn away from or not confront. But I'd like to ask each of you to name one kind of image or theme or message or slogan from your research that we should not turn away from, that has a certain significance that must be confronted or stared at in the face, no matter how discomforting or upsetting that is.
Well, the one image I found in a garage sale of a children's book which teaches the alphabet. And of course, the stereotype, you begin with children. You start with a child. And it's an ugly fat Arab sitting on an ass. And the caption is, A is for Arab, which is the title of the book.
What period is this, Jack?
This was probably I could look it up, but I think it was 1970s.
Wow.
That more than any other image.
Well, it's tough to pick because we've come across so many. But one of the themes that we explored in the book in terms of images is a very long tradition of depicting a sort of solitary white man about to be overwhelmed by a horde, and we have images across hundreds of years, and actually many of the movies Jack writes about, that image is there. That image was used to celebrate Custer against Native Americans, right. David Crockett against the Mexicans, right. The French against the Muslims in Spain. So, and I think that notion that there are two kinds of people in the world, individuals and hordes, robot clones, ants, and that those are somehow connected categories, one needs the other to kind of make sense, really lends us towards some very dehumanizing practices.
This one isn't in our book, but it's something that comes out of my childhood, and certainly when our daughter came of age, reading to her. It's The Five Chinese Brothers, which is the American version of the story, which is all the Chinese brothers are all looking the same, except they have different powers and all that We know that. And it's based on a Chinese story, which actually is not, in which the five brothers are all the same. But I think it's a very powerful, seemingly innocent representation, stereotype, children's book. But it does immediately lend into the contemporary issues of Chinese really being clones of each other, not being individual, being similar. We see this in a lot of the science fiction films that are both dystopic and utopic. Asians are really kind of weird because they are a faceless mass and they're all the same. But it also plays itself out in the whole argument about copyright and knockoffs, which, of course, we're right in Chinatown, and Mayor Bloomberg had this whole campaign against kind of blocking off a whole block of Chinatown because this was supposedly the global center of knockoffs in the world, and he had to cut it at its source, and some of that money was financing terrorists. Right now, this whole image of knockoffs goes deep into the American culture, made in Japan, made in Hong Kong, made in Taiwan, made in China. These are all seen as cheap knockoffs, and the knockoff attitude is transferred over to people as well. So this is where things and people and ideas all get kind of lumped together, and it's actually quite seemingly innocent on one hand, but deeply entrenched in all sorts of policy issues about what is the individual, what's original, and what's a copy.
We've had a very fruitful discussion this evening with Jack G. Shaheen, author of A is for Arab, Archiving Stereotypes in U.S. Popular Culture, and with Jack Tchen and Dylan Yeats, editors of Yellow Peril, an archive of anti-Asian fear. I'd like to thank the Museum of Chinese in America and this panel of scholars and experts for their time, their insights, and their dedicated work.
All of us will go back tonight more enriched and even more thoughtful. Perhaps a little burdened by the state of the world, but at the same time, I think heartened by knowing that so many of us are thinking about the same issues, and a lot of people are doing their part in countering that. So thank you once again, Judge Shaheen, Dylan Yeats, John and Jack Tchen, and Sewell Chan for this wonderful panel. And I just want to particularly thank Jack Tchen, who is also the co-founder of the Museum of Chinese in America. We thank you for bringing this wonderful program here tonight. Part 2 of this program will be the face-off with this team with Fox News. I'm kidding, I wish. But let's have the part 2 of the program is a book signing by the authors upstairs in the lobby. So for those of you who have not bought the books, buy the books, get them signed, and have a wonderful night home. And I hope to see you back here in the Museum of Chinese in America.
C-SPAN 2, providing live coverage of the U.S. Senate floor proceedings and key public policy events.